So today we have a partial clog. I like to call this type of a clog a cold clog because the filament broke off at the top and it kept on going until it just couldn't push through anymore. There is no actual clog between the hot end and the cold end, but it is a bit of a pain and we'll need to take it apart. First we need to take the 3 screws off that are holding the extruder assembly at the back. This is done with a small Phillips head screwdriver. Make sure that you're holding onto the head on the last screw so that the head doesn't fall down. Now that we have the extruder assembly taken off, we're going to take the wire loom bracket off. And we're also going to take the extruder wiring bracket, or hub, if you will, off as well. There's 1 screw holding that one on and 2 holding the wire loom on. To make sure that we don't lose any of these screws, I like to screw them back into the nuts that they came from. That way I also know where they're coming from and I can't lose them by dropping them on the floor. Now that that's complete, I'm going to disconnect all my wiring from the harness. That way I can see the extruder bolts that I need to get to so that I can take it apart properly. Now that the wiring is out of the way, I can pick up a 2mm hex wrench. This way I can access the 3 bolts that are holding on the plate at the extruder. Now we'll be able to take the plate off, and be careful, we want to get rid of this spring without actually losing it. After that, we want to take the fan off the heatsink and we want to pry out the cold assembly. Watch out because the filament guide might fly off just like it did on me. We now have the hot end and the cold end out of the assembly, and now we want to take the heatsink off, unscrewing it. Once we have it unscrewed, like I said, we have a cold clog, and this filament will just pop out, just like that. Now that the filament is out, we want to take the nozzle off of the hot end, because we can't see through to make sure that the clog is entirely clear. If you can't get the nozzle off this way, you might want to heat up your extruder again by plugging it back in and heating it up to the temperature of the PLA or the ABS, whatever filament you were using to start with. Once you have it all off and disconnected, we want to take a look down the throat and make sure everything is clear. Here we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, so my throat is clear, but I'm also using an all-metal throat. For the reassembly, I want to back off my throat from the heat block a little bit so that I can actually get my nozzle all the way in and then back it out later. For this video, I'm going to take the nozzle clean out so that you can see how the hot end gets assembled properly to begin with. To do that, I'm going to use what we use for soldering a lot of the times, called helping hands. You can use anything. I'm just using this so that I can keep the hot end away from everything and that I can't burn myself. Now that I've powered up the machine, I've heated up my heat block to 195 because I was using PLA, and I'm gonna back off the throat. I'm going to hold my heat block in place so the wires don't get damaged, and now I'm going to just back it off. It should back off really easily. The filament, any filament that is in there, should be loose and soft enough for you not to have to use both set of pliers the entire time. If you have the original throat from the gantry, you'll probably still have a PTFE tube in there. You'll want to look down the throat and make sure that PTFE tube is still intact and butted up against the bottom. Now that we've confirmed that our PTFE tube is completely clear, everything is good to go, we're going to throw our nozzle back onto the heat block. Be careful, the heat block is still currently hot at this time. We're going to thread it in right so that the nozzle butts right up against the heat block. Once the nozzle is butted all the way up against the heat block, we're going to turn it back out half a turn because we're going to use that to lock the throat and the nozzle together. Now that that's done, let's get the throat and screw that into our heat block, right up until it butts up against the nozzle. Once we have the throat all the way in, we're going to use our pliers to lightly tighten, and then we're going to go back to our nozzle and lock it in place properly. Pliers are not the best thing to do or to use for this because you can easily slip and you can destroy your nozzle. Your best bet is to use an actual 7mm driver for it. I don't happen to have one, so I'm just using my pliers. Now that the hot end is fully assembled, we're going to shut down our machine. Make sure that our hot end is cold, that way we can do the rest of the assembly. First thing we need to do is reinstall our heatsink onto our throat. We're going to screw this down just so that we still have our heat break. I have mine set up so that it locks in place. And then once that's done, we can take our assembly and put it back together. I noticed I have a little bit of filament that got chewed by the gear. So in those places I want to clean it up, so I'm going to take the extruder apart even further so I can clean the housing properly. Now that it's completely cleaned out, I can continue with my assembly. If you didn't need to clean the housing from all the filament scraps, then let's just go to and install our hot end back to the way it was. Once the hot end is installed, we'll want to put the filament guide back on top of it. Make sure that it's snugly seated all the way in, otherwise the outside plate that we'll put on later won't sit properly. Once your hot end is in with your filament guide, we're going to put our tensioner back in. Make sure to screw the nut all the way down so that the spring is as loose as it can be. It'll make for assembly much easier. Once that's in place, we're going to take our plate and we're going to put it back on top, aligning all the holes that we need to. Now, with the screws that we have just taken out earlier, you'll see that one of the three screws is actually shorter. That shorter screw is going to end up going to the bottom right over here, and the other two are going to go in the top left and the bottom left. Doesn't really matter how you screw these in first. I like to do the small one first because it does not actually mount to the mounting plate later. When screwing in the two screws on the left, like I am right now, start one of them first. Don't tighten it entirely. Get to the other screw, tighten that up, make sure it's actually screwing in properly, and then go back and tighten everything after. This way everything is aligned properly. Now we're ready to put our wiring harnesses all back, our looms back on, and assemble the rest of the extruder. Now that that's done, we're going to flip it over, get our fan back onto our heatsink, making sure that when we place our fan onto the heatsink, the bottom of the fan is in line with the bottom of the heatsink. Now that that's installed, we can go ahead and plug all of our fans and our thermistors and everything back in. The bottom right connector is used for the heatsink fan, which is always on. The upper one is for the part cooling fan. The bottom connectors are for the light, the thermistor, and the heater core. The far right is the light, the far left is the heater, and the middle is the thermistor. It's easier to plug the thermistor in first and then the exterior ones. We can now attach the full assembly back on to the gantry. 3 screws that we have, we'll just put them back in. Make sure that when you're tightening everything up, you're starting all the screws first before you actually tighten everything up. And this concludes my very first tutorial on how to clear a clog on the AdimLab Gantry Pro. If the video was helpful, please hit the like button. If you want to see specific videos in the future, feel free to comment on them. But don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell at the bottom. And if you feel others could benefit from these videos, please share them.